What would you do if the man who kidnapped you on your wedding day was the only one who ever truly saw you? The night Clara Davis lost everything: her groom, her future, her last illusion of safety. She was standing in a room full of people who loved her, and not one of them could save her. Viridian City does not sleep. It hums, a city of glass towers, underground empires, and secrets kept alive by people who have learned that darkness is safer than the light. On the highest floor of the Celestine Hotel, 200 guests had gathered to celebrate what appeared to be the wedding of the year. Clara Davis stood at the center of it all. Her gown caught the neon glow the way water catches fire, brilliantly, briefly, as though beauty this fragile was never meant to last. Steady hands, a smile her face had learned, over many years, to wear convincingly. At her side, Marcus Allen, handsome, charming, son of a senator, perfect for her. The guests whispered behind their champagne flutes. Such a lovely pair. No one could see what lived beneath that white gown. Not joy, not peace, only the quiet, persistent ache of a woman who had spent her entire life being chosen for things, and never once choosing for herself. Her father had approved the match. Her stepmother, the composed and unreadable Mrs. Vance, had arranged the venue. Everyone agreed this was right. Clara slid the ring toward Marcus's finger, and somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a shadow moved. What no one at that wedding knew was that Clara had kept one small, private ritual since the age of 14. Every morning, before the world could ask anything of her, she would sit alone at the kitchen window with a cup of tea gone cold and read one page from whatever book her mother had left behind. Her mother, who died when Clara was 9, whose face she could no longer fully picture, only the warmth of her hands and the smell of old paper. A foolish, tender little habit, the kind that keeps a lonely person tethered to the belief that love, once given, does not entirely disappear. She had done it that very morning, her wedding morning. She had chosen a page at random, and the line her eyes landed on, almost like a warning she hadn't understood, read, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." She smiled softly, closed the book, and went to become a bride. She had no idea what kind of door was already swinging open. The lights died at exactly 8:47 p.m. Not a flicker, a total, instantaneous erasure, as though something ancient and unhurried had simply decided the light was no longer necessary. Then he stepped out of the dark. He looked no older than 30, jet black hair, pale skin that absorbed the neon glow bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows rather than reflecting it, dark glasses that did nothing to hide the absolute stillness of a man who had not been startled by anything in a very long time. 200 people fell silent. Clara's breath stopped, because she knew that face. She had seen it across the breakfast table. She had heard that voice ask, politely, whether she had finished with the newspaper. She had lived beside this man for 4 years, believing, as everyone believed, that he was simply Mrs. Vance's quiet, private son. His gaze did not move to the crowd, not to the trembling officiant, not to the senator's son frozen at the altar, only to her. And when he spoke, his voice was low and absolute, the voice of something that has waited 3 centuries and will not wait a single moment more. "Clara Davis, tonight, you become mine." The window shattered. His arm closed around her waist, cold as marble, unyielding as fate. And then the floor was gone, the ceiling was gone, the wedding was gone, and she was rising into the Viridian City night as a single drop of her blood fell slowly through the neon air, glowing with a soft light that neither of them yet understood. She had no idea that everything was about to change. He kidnapped her, but something in her blood made him stop. What is she carrying that even the Vampire King cannot resist? If the man who took you turned out to be the only one who never lied to your face, would you stay, or would you run anyway? Tell me in 3 words. She woke up to silence. Not the comfortable silence of a Sunday morning, or the hushed quiet of a library. This was the silence of a place that had never known warmth. A silence so complete, it pressed against her chest like a held breath. Clara opened her eyes. The room was vast and dark, furnished in deep charcoal and aged wood, vaulted ceilings that vanished into shadow overhead. Tall, arched windows lined one wall, each sealed behind heavy black curtains. A single oil lamp burned on the nightstand, casting amber tremors across the stone floor. She was still in her wedding gown. The ring, Marcus's ring, was gone from her finger. She sat up sharply, and the memories crashed back. The ballroom, the darkness, the cold arm around her waist, the shattering glass. Him, Ethan. She forced herself to think clearly, the way her father had always taught her. Name what you know. Work with what's real. What she knew. She was inside a mansion somewhere in Viridian City. She had no phone, no shoes, and a torn hem on a ruined gown. What was real? The man she had called her stepbrother for 4 years was the Vampire King, and he had brought her here on purpose. She tried the door. It opened. That frightened her more than a lock would have. The hallway beyond was cathedral quiet, lined with dark portraits and iron sconces burning low. Clara moved carefully, cataloging every door, every turn, every possible exit. And then she rounded a corner and stopped. Ethan stood at the far end of the corridor, his back to her, hands clasped behind him, facing a window covered from the outside so that not even the city's glow could reach him. Simply standing in the dark. The way people stand when they have been alone long enough that stillness no longer bothers them. Without turning, he said, "The kitchen is to your left. Mrs. Vance made tea." Clara stared at the back of his head. Not a threat, not an explanation. Tea. "I want to go home," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. A pause. Then, quietly, "I know." He still didn't turn around, as though he didn't trust himself to look at her. She turned left. She went to the kitchen. She drank the tea. The days that followed settled into a strange, suspended rhythm. Ethan did not lock her doors. He did not forbid her from walking the corridors or the enclosed garden in the East Wing, where pale flowers bloomed without sunlight beneath glass panels. He never explained himself, never justified what he had done, never delivered the villain's speech she had half braced for. He was simply present, quietly, infuriatingly present. By day, he kept his distance, appearing at mealtimes with the same composed courtesy she remembered from her father's house, answering questions in short sentences, asking nothing in return. By night, he disappeared entirely. Clara told herself this arrangement was temporary. She was gathering information, learning the layout, waiting for her moment. She was not growing accustomed to the sound of his footsteps in the hall. She was not finding the mansion's stillness, in some inexplicable way, more peaceful than her own home had ever been. She was not. The crack appeared on the 5th day, from something small, as cracks usually do. She found him in the library at dusk, sitting in the chair closest to an unlit fireplace, holding something in his hands. He hadn't heard her approach. For perhaps 30 seconds, she stood in the doorway and watched. He was holding a photograph. Small, slightly curled at the edges. In it, a woman with dark eyes and a wide, unguarded smile, holding a small boy on her knee. A boy who couldn't have been older than 4, laughing at something outside the frame. That pure, unself-conscious laugh that only very young children and very safe people produce. Ethan's thumb moved across the photograph. Just once, she stepped back before he could sense her. But the image stayed with her the rest of the night, quiet and insistent, like something she hadn't meant to learn. On the 7th morning, she found a small box outside her door. Inside, a necklace, a single dark pendant on a fine silver chain, shaped like a droplet, deep red at the center, like preserved amber wrapped around something luminous. No note. Mrs. Vance appeared at the end of the corridor, watching Clara turn the pendant over in her fingers. "He made that himself," she said, "a long time ago. It was intended to be a tool of revenge. Then he finished it, and couldn't bring himself to use it." Before Clara could press further, Mrs. Vance moved quietly away. That night, Clara put the necklace on, telling herself it was strategic, a way to lower his guard. She kept telling herself that right up until she fell asleep. Then the dreams began. Fire, the smell of burning cedar, a child's voice cut off mid-word, and Ethan, not cold and composed as she knew him, but wild-eyed and desperate, clawing through collapsed timbers with his bare hands, his silver scar glowing through his shirt. She woke, gasping, her hand flying to the pendant at her throat. It was warm, impossibly warm, as though it had been resting in sunlight. Her blood felt strange, humming, like a string plucked in a resonant room. For the first time, she wondered, what exactly am I carrying inside me? She confronted him the next morning in the lower-level training room, a vast space of mirrored walls and stone, where she found him moving through drills alone, controlled, precise. He was shirtless. The silver scar across his chest caught the light with every movement, wide and ragged, the kind left not by a blade, but by something that had burned. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. He stopped too. "You knew," she said, "when you lived in my father's house. You knew what you were planning. You sat at our table and asked how my day was." His jaw tightened. "Yes." "Then why wait? You had every opportunity." He turned away, pressing a cloth to a cut on his forearm. Old silver shrapnel, she realized, a wound that had never fully healed. He held pressure on it with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a man who had long since stopped expecting wounds to stop. "Because," he said quietly, "the longer I watched you, the harder it became to hold on to the version of you I needed you to be." Clara felt that land somewhere below her ribs. She was furious at herself for it. Furious at him for saying it with such stripped-down honesty, as though the admission cost him nothing and everything simultaneously. "I'm not your redemption," she said, "and I'm not your revenge." "No," he agreed. "You're something I don't have a name for yet." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time in days. Dark glasses off, eyes red only at the outer edges, darker and more human at the center than she was prepared for. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she walked out, and did not let herself run until she was around the corner, her heart slamming against her ribs, the pendant warm against her sternum, and something cracking open inside her chest that she was absolutely not ready to name. The blood bond had its own agenda. That night, she dreamed of a woman's face and a little boy's laugh, and the sound a family makes when it ceases to exist. Not with a crash, with a silence so abrupt it rearranges every quiet moment that comes after. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and tried to decide what to do with that understanding. Then her phone lit up on the nightstand. Mrs. Vance had returned it 2 days earlier, quietly, without explanation. A message from Marcus. I know where you are, Clara, and I know what he is. Stay alive. I'm coming. When I get there, you'll finally understand who the real monster is. Before you decide who the monster is, wait until you find out what Marcus was doing the night Ethan's family died. She read Marcus's message 3 times. Each time, the words rearranged themselves into something different. A threat, then a warning, then something that felt like a script someone had rehearsed. Stay alive. I'm coming for you. The phrasing of a rescuer, the cadence of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She set the phone face down and lay in the dark, listening to her own pulse. Something was wrong with that message. She couldn't name it precisely, but the confidence of, I know where you are, the deliberate weight of, you'll finally understand. These were not the words of a frightened fiancé. They were the words of someone running a plan. She said nothing to Ethan. The next morning, he was already gone when she came down to the kitchen. Mrs. Vance stood at the window, watching the garden with the stillness of a woman accustomed to carrying weight without letting it alter her posture. He had business, she said. He'll be back before dark. What kind of business? Mrs. Vance turned, and this time she didn't deflect. She set down her cup, folded her hands, and sat across from Clara with the unhurried manner of someone who has decided, after a long time, that the truth has finally earned its moment. The kind that started long before you were born, she said, and the kind you deserve to understand. Richard Davis had not acted alone. Mrs. Vance delivered this gently, the way a doctor delivers difficult news, not cruelly, but with the full weight of its consequence already present in her voice. 5 years ago, the raid on the Eternal Night Syndicate had been coordinated at the highest levels of the Hunter Guild. Clara's father had led the operation. Yes, but he had not conceived it. He had not chosen the night, the method, or the target. He had been handed orders signed by Senator Allen and told the compound housed a violent extremist cell threatening the city. He had believed them. Your father is proud and sometimes blind in the way powerful men can be, Mrs. Vance said carefully. But he is not a man who would have walked into a family home knowing what was inside. What was inside? Clara asked. A pause. A woman named Lyra, 31 years old. She had spent 2 years trying to broker a peace agreement between the syndicate and the guild, writing letters, requesting meetings, being turned away. She believed peace was possible. She kept believing it right up until the night the raid came. And the boy, Clara said softly, 4 years old. His name was Leo. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara's hand had moved to the pendant at her throat, fingers wrapped around it, the way she used to hold her mother's book. As though an object could absorb what her hands didn't know what to do with. Lyra had been building toward peace. Leo had been 4 years old, and her father, her steady, principled father, had been the instrument of their deaths. Aimed and fired by a man with something far more strategic in mind. She thought of the photograph in the library, Ethan's thumb moving once across it. She thought of his restraint. 4 years in her father's house, every morning, every meal, every ordinary evening, and understood for the first time what that had actually required of him. Not just patience, not just discipline, the deliberate, daily choice to hold back a grief that had been sharpened by 5 years into something capable of destroying everything it touched. It wasn't absolution. She wasn't ready to call it that. But it was the beginning of something. The slow, uncomfortable work of understanding that hatred. When fed long enough on real injustice, stops being a flaw and starts being the only response that makes sense. He didn't come back before dark. By 9 o'clock, the mansion had shifted into a quality of silence she hadn't felt before. Not the settled quiet of the past 2 weeks, but something with a hollow at its center. She walked the corridors without purpose, past the library, the chair beside the unlit fireplace empty, past the training room, dark, the mirrored walls reflecting only her own pale face, past the locked door at the end of the east wing, the one she had decided early on not to push. She stopped outside it now, pressed her palm flat against the old wood. Through it, nothing but the pendant warmed suddenly against her sternum, and the back of her neck prickled with the specific awareness of a person who has understood. Too late. That they are not where the danger is. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. No greeting, no name, only an address. And beneath it, 6 words. He walked into a trap. Come alone. She came alone. The address led to the Eternal Grove perimeter, the edge of the sacred forest on the city's southern outskirts, where the ancient trees grew so dense that Viridian City's light couldn't reach the ground, and the earth was soft with centuries of fallen leaves. Clara moved through the dark with her phone's light low, her pulse controlled. Telling herself she was making a rational decision. She found them in the warehouse at the forest's edge. Vast. Cold. Industrial lighting that turned every shadow surgical. And in the center of the floor, surrounded by 4 armed Hunter Guild operatives, was Ethan, on his knees. Silver shackles bolted to a restraining track in the concrete, the metal burning wherever it contacted his skin. She could see the faint smoke rising from his wrists from the doorway. His jaw was set in the rigid stillness of a man refusing, through sheer force of will, to make a sound. Standing before him, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man precisely where he expected to be. Marcus. Not frightened, not urgent, not the face of someone who had raced across the city to rescue the woman he claimed to love. The face of a man running an operation. Clara, he said warmly, turning as she stepped inside. Right on time. Everything in her went very still. You sent the text, she said. I needed you to see this. He gestured toward Ethan. The casual, proprietary gesture of someone who has already decided what something is worth. I needed you to understand what he actually is. What he was always going to do. Ethan's eyes found hers across the warehouse. His face was bloodless. His wrists were smoking. And in his eyes, red at the edges, darker at the center. She saw something she had never seen there before. Not rage, not the cold. Controlled certainty she had come to recognize as his resting state. Fear. Not for himself. Clara, he said. His voice was low and stripped of everything except the single thing left beneath the centuries and the darkness and the long, careful restraint. Leave. No. Please. Please. From him. In that voice. In that room. Something detonated in her chest that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Marcus stepped closer to her. His voice measured and warm. He kidnapped you. He bonded you without your consent. He was going to use you to destroy your own father. I'm the one trying to protect you. I always have been. She looked at Marcus. His easy posture. His prepared speech. 4 armed operatives. A bolt track. Silver shackles. All of it assembled with the efficiency of something planned long before anyone needed rescuing. She looked at Ethan, who was asking her to run. And in that moment, she realized the terrible truth. Marcus had never come to save her. He had come to make sure she watched. Marcus says he's the protector, but he knew exactly where she was from the very beginning. Ask yourself, how she did not run. She stood in the center of that cold warehouse and looked at Marcus. Really looked at him, the way she had never quite allowed herself to before, and made a decision so quiet it barely registered as one. She walked toward Ethan. Clara, Marcus's voice sharpened. The warmth drained out of it like water from a cracked glass. What are you doing? She didn't answer. Past the operatives who shifted uneasily, past the bolt track in the concrete, until she was close enough to see the full damage the silver had done to his wrists. Raw and darkened, the skin worn down to something that had no business being exposed. She crouched in front of him. His eyes met hers, up close. In the surgical glare of the warehouse lights, she could see how much the restraint was costing him. Not the physical pain, which a being 3 centuries old had presumably learned to metabolize, but the effort of remaining still, of not fighting, of keeping his expression composed while she stood within reach and he could do neither. How long have you known it was a trap? She asked quietly. Since I left the mansion. Then why walk into it? A pause. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and unguarded. Marcus sent documentation, evidence that your father was about to be arrested, framed on fabricated charges. I thought if I came alone, I could contain it before it reached you. Clara was quiet for a moment. You walked into a silver trap to protect my father, she said. Your enemy's father. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes didn't leave hers. And that, she thought, was its own kind of answer. This is very touching, Marcus said behind her, voice gone flat. But we're finished here. He crossed the floor in 4 steps and closed his hand around Clara's arm. Firm. Practiced. The grip of a man who had done this before. Pulling her to her feet. Your father has been under guild surveillance for 3 months, he said, low and clipped. Not for anything he actually did. I needed leverage. Over him. Over you. Over whatever has developed between you and this creature. You framed my father. I managed a situation. The distinction seemed genuinely important to him. The guild is a resource, Clara. The Eternal Grove contains something worth considerably more than any peace treaty. My father understood that 20 years ago. You were there. Ethan's voice was quiet, but something in its cadence made every person in that warehouse go still. 5 years ago, Ethan said, eyes fixed on Marcus with the flat, lightless focus of a man reaching the end of a very long road. You were 19. Stationed outside the perimeter as a lookout. But you went inside. And you ordered the operatives to proceed after they reported the compound was residential. That there were civilians. That there was a child. The warehouse was absolutely silent. You knew, Clara said. Not to Ethan, to Marcus. Marcus. Perhaps because the performance had finally exhausted him. Or perhaps because he had never truly believed it needed to hold. Didn't deny it. My father needed the Grove access codes. The syndicate elder held them. There wasn't time to negotiate. His name was Leo, Clara said. He was 4 years old. Marcus blinked. In the half-second before he recovered his expression, she saw it. Not guilt, but something colder and more revealing. The look of a man who has genuinely never assigned weight to certain categories of loss. She pulled her arm free. One of the operatives stepped toward her. Ethan surged forward against the restraints, a full-body lurch that tore the bolt track anchor a full inch from the concrete floor. The chains held. But the operative stopped. In the frozen moment that followed, Marcus raised his other hand. In it, a compact, matte black device with a single red indicator light. Concentrated UV emitter, he said pleasantly. enough to cause irreversible damage to a vampire in under a minute. He looked at Clara. Here is what happens next. You come with me. You provide a voluntary blood sample. Your blood has properties my father's researchers have been tracking for years. And I release him. Simple. Clara looked at the device. She looked at Ethan, who had gone completely still in the way of someone who has run the numbers and doesn't like what they say. She looked down at the pendant, warm against her sternum. Even now, even here, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. She closed her hand around it, and she made her choice. You want my blood, she said. Then take off the shackles first. Clara, a warning in Ethan's voice. Take them off, she said again. Steady. You don't need them if you have me voluntarily. And you do have me. I'm not running. Marcus studied her, searching. She knew. For the angle, the strategy, the hidden move. Finding, perhaps, a woman who had simply stopped calculating. He nodded to the nearest operative. The shackles fell. Ethan rose slowly. His wrists were damaged, the burns deep. He looked at her. Don't, his eyes said. Watch me. Hers answered. She lifted the pendant from her throat, the chain snapping cleanly, and held it in her open palm. In the harsh warehouse light, the dark glass had gone luminous. That same faint inner glow she had first seen falling through the Viridian city sky the night he took her. You want pure light blood, she said to Marcus. You should know what it actually does. She pressed the pendant between both palms. The glass cracked. Warmth moved outward. Not heat, but something older than heat. The way sunlight feels not on the skin, but somehow beneath it. The operative stepped back involuntarily. Marcus raised the UV emitter. And Ethan, moving with the speed of 3 centuries of survival, wrists still raw, eyes blazing red, stepped directly in front of her. Not beside her. Not behind her. In front. You want to use that, he said to Marcus, his voice stripped and absolute. Aim it at me. The light from Clara's hands reached his skin, and where it touched the burns at his wrists, the damaged tissue began, slowly, to close. She felt him draw a sharp breath, felt the exact moment, through the bond humming between them, when he understood what was happening. Not a weapon, not a cure, a choice, offered willingly, the only form in which it had ever been able to work. Clara, he said, barely above a whisper. Just her name, but carrying in it 300 years of accumulated grief and the precise, staggering weight of something a person had surrendered, and then, impossibly, been given back. She looked at him over his shoulder. This ancient, wounded, carefully restrained man who had held his rage like a burning coal for 5 years, and quietly, inexplicably, chosen not to use it on her. I know, she said softly. Marcus fired. The light hit Clara's open hands first, and scattered. Broke apart the way a wave breaks against something it was never designed to move. Marcus stared. Pure light blood doesn't destroy, Clara said. It reveals. And in that cold warehouse, with Ethan standing between her and the thing trying to harm her, and Marcus's carefully constructed world finally, completely coming apart. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew exactly what she had to do. She just scattered a weapon with her bare hands. But the harder question is whether she can do what comes next. Face her father with the truth. He stepped in front of her, knowing it would hurt him. Not because she asked, not because it was planned, just because. Is that what 300 years of living looks like? When it finally becomes worth it? Tell me what you think. The light did not fade, so much as settle. It moved outward from Clara's hands in slow, even rings, the way a stone dropped in still water travels, without urgency, without violence. And where it touched the warehouse walls, the shadows peeled back. Where it reached the operatives, they lowered their weapons one by one, with the particular bewildered expression of men who have suddenly and inconveniently remembered something they believed before they were paid not to. Marcus did not lower the emitter, but his hand had begun to shake. "This isn't possible," he said. And for the first time since Clara had known him, through 2 years of courtship, one almost wedding, and every carefully assembled performance in between, his voice carried something unscripted, not guilt, not quite fear. The look of a man watching the story he built about himself begin to unravel at its seams. "It's entirely possible," Clara said quietly. "You simply never considered that some things can't be taken." The emitter hit the floor. What followed happened quickly. Ethan's hand at her back, steady and warm. Warm for the first time. As Hunter Guild reinforcements arrived through the warehouse doors. Not Marcus's operatives, her father's division. Mrs. Vance, it emerged, had made a phone call approximately 2 hours earlier. The arrests were not dramatic. No final speech, no last stand. Just 2 men, Marcus and the senator, collected separately, led out into the gray pre-dawn air as the slow machinery of consequence began to turn. Clara watched them go. Then she sat down on the concrete floor, her back against the wall, the cracked pendant in both hands, and simply breathed. Ethan sat beside her, not close enough to presume, not distant either. The careful distance of a man still learning that not assuming and not wanting are different things, and that one of them no longer applies. For a while. Neither spoke. The warehouse settled around them. Dawn was arriving somewhere beyond the walls. She could feel it in the way the shadows along the floor were softening from black to gray. Somewhere outside. The Eternal Grove was already in full morning light. "You walked into a trap to protect my father," she said finally. "He's safe," Ethan said. Mrs. Vance had the fabricated surveillance files removed before midnight. "Nothing will hold." She nodded. "You could have told me. You had enough to carry." She turned the broken pendant over in her fingers. The cracked glass, the residue of warmth still caught inside it. She thought of finding it outside her door, of Mrs. Vance's quiet explanation. He finished it and couldn't bring himself to use it. "What was it supposed to be?" she asked. Before a long pause. "A binding tool," he said. "I made it to complete the revenge. To ensure your family could never endanger anyone I cared about again." He was quiet for a moment. And then I held it. And I kept finding reasons to wait. Week after week. "Because of me," she said. "Because every time I watched you, at the window with your tea, with your mother's book, it became harder to hold on to the version of you I needed for the plan to make sense." She looked at the pendant. He looked at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. And in 3 centuries, she suspected, those words had not come easily, or often. For the wedding, for taking you, for every year I sat in your father's house telling myself it was strategy, when it was something else entirely. What was it? Something shifted in his face. That brief, unguarded thing she had been cataloging for weeks, now fully surfaced and staying. "Fear," he said, "that if I destroyed your family the way mine was destroyed, I wouldn't feel any better. I would only be more alone." She reached over and took his hand. His wrists had closed. The burns healed, but she could feel the history of the damage in the way he went briefly, completely still at her touch, the stillness of someone receiving something they had quietly stopped expecting. She held his hand in both of hers, not as a declaration, not as a resolution, simply as an acknowledgement that some things need to be held while they find their shape. "Leo," she said softly, "tell me about him." Ethan's throat moved. For a moment, she thought 3 centuries of controlled silence might be too deep to uproot here, in a warehouse at dawn. And that was all right. She wasn't asking him to be healed, only to be known. Then, quietly, he began. Small things. The way Leo carried rocks in his pockets because he couldn't bear to leave interesting ones behind. The way Lyra had read to him in 2 languages, alternating sentences, so he fell asleep to the sound of both worlds coexisting. The way he laughed, at things that weren't funny to anyone else, because the world was still, to him, reliably delightful. Clara sat in the slowly brightening warehouse and listened. She did not offer comfort through words, because some losses don't want to be comforted. They want, simply, to be witnessed. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a while. Then he turned his hand over in hers and held on. Richard Davis arrived just after sunrise. He was older than Clara sometimes let herself notice, more gray in his hair, his posture carrying the weight of a man still setting down something heavy. He crossed the warehouse floor and pulled his daughter into his arms without a word, and she pressed her face against his shoulder the way she had not allowed herself to since she was 9 years old. After a moment, he pulled back. His eyes moved to Ethan, who had risen to his feet. The 2 men looked at each other. Clara had imagined this moment. She had not imagined it would be quiet. She had not imagined her father's face would carry grief rather than fury. The face of a man whose understanding of a story he had lived completely has just been rebuilt from the ground up. "I didn't know," Davis said. "About Lyra, about Leo. I was given orders, told who the enemy was. And I..." He stopped. "That is not enough of an explanation. I know that." "I know you know," Ethan said. Simply, completely. Davis closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "I am sorry," he said, "for what my hand, however it was directed, did to your family." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the particular fragility of something that could still break, but was choosing, with great care, not to. Ethan inclined his head. Not as erasure, not as a pardon that cost nothing, as the acknowledgement of a man accepting what cannot be undone, and choosing, with full knowledge of the price, to begin with what remains. Mrs. Vance, standing at the warehouse door, allowed herself a small and private smile. The peace treaty between the Eternal Night Syndicate and the Hunter Guild was signed 3 days later. Not in a government hall, but at a plain wooden table carried out among the trees of the Eternal Grove itself, with birds audible in the canopy and the smell of damp earth rising from roots that had been there longer than the city surrounding them. The house felt different now. Not only Ethan's mansion, though that too had begun to change. Curtains opened incrementally. The enclosed garden tended with more attention. The locked east wing door finally opened to reveal nothing more sinister than a room full of a small boy's drawings, preserved in careful frames. Clara's house. Her father's house. The kitchen window. The cold tea. Her mother's books on the shelf. She went back to it 3 days after the signing, on a morning that smelled of rain and old paper. She sat at the window and read one page. The line her eyes found. The ones who survive the dark are not the ones who feared it least. They are the ones who found something worth returning to. She closed the book. She looked out at the gray Viridian city morning, at the glass towers and their secrets, and the world going about its complicated business of existing. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, something settled in her chest, like a key finally turning in a lock she had stopped trying to open. Not finished. not fixed, but pointed, unmistakably, towards something that had not been there before. One door closed. But watch what Ethan does next. The last choice he makes will be the one nobody saw coming. 3 weeks after the treaty was signed, she helped him hang the last of Leo's drawings. They had found 47 of them in the East Wing. Crayon on paper. A 4-year-old's complete and confident cosmology. Houses with enormous chimneys. Dogs the size of horses. A recurring figure with jet black scribbled hair that Clara chose not to comment on. Because some things don't need to be named to be understood. They had framed 30 of them. The rest sat loosely on a low shelf. Not archived, not finished. Available. The way things are arranged by people who expect to keep returning to them. Ethan held the last frame to the wall, while Clara marked the anchor point. They had developed a rhythm for this kind of work, the particular, unspoken choreography of two people who have learned each other's habits without meaning to. She stepped back and looked at the wall. He would have liked this room, she said. Ethan studied the drawings for a long moment. He would have repainted all of them by next week. He always wanted to improve on the last version he'd made. Clara laughed, quietly, genuinely. And the sound moved through the East Wing room the way light moves through a window opened for the first time in years. On the morning of the first anniversary of the peace treaty, Clara woke early and went to the kitchen. She made tea she would let go cold. She took her mother's book from the shelf beside the window. It had made the journey here 3 months ago. In a canvas bag with her coffee mug and her reading glasses, and the few other objects that follow a person through their life like quiet anchors. She chose a page at random and read one line. To be loved after great loss is not a miracle. It is simply what love does, when it is allowed to. She sat with that for a moment. Outside. The mansion garden was doing what gardens do in early morning, existing without commentary. Pale flowers open beneath the glass panels, the first gray light beginning to arrive. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, unhurried. She had long since stopped cataloging them as anything other than familiar. He appeared in the doorway, and she pushed the book across the table toward him without a word. He read the line. He set the book down. For a while they simply sat together in the early quiet, with the cold tea and the garden and the morning doing its ordinary, irreplaceable work around them. Then he stood. "Come with me," he said. He led her to the front door of the mansion. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that the door stood fully open. Late autumn sunlight falling in a wide, clean rectangle across the stone floor. And Ethan was standing at its edge, in the way a person stands at the boundary of a significant thing. Aware of what it costs, choosing it anyway. Clara came to stand beside him. She didn't take his hand. She didn't offer reassurance. She had learned, slowly, and with some difficulty, because reassurance had been her primary survival tool for most of her life, that some moments don't need tending. They need only a witness. He stood there for a long time. Then he stepped forward. The sunlight caught him. He closed his eyes. And on his face, for one long, unguarded moment, was the expression of a man receiving something he had genuinely believed was no longer available to him. Not redemption, not absolution, but something simpler and older and more necessary than either. Just warmth. The patient. Enduring warmth of a world that had been here the entire time, waiting for him to stop closing the door against it. Clara stood beside him in the light and watched. And she finally understood something she had been circling for months. Love is not the thing that repairs a person. It is the thing that remains present while they find their way back to themselves. Without urgency, without demand, the way a kitchen window and a cold cup of tea and a book opened to the right page remains present. It says, "I am not going anywhere. Take the time you need." That is not a small thing. That is, in the end, everything. This story reminds us that the deepest wounds are rarely healed by grand gestures or final confrontations, or the dramatic resolution of old wrongs. They are healed the way Clara healed Ethan, and the way, in time, he quietly healed her in return. By showing up on an ordinary morning, by sitting with someone in the part of their life that is still dark, without trying to force the lights on, by learning the small things, the tea gone cold, the book read one page at a time, the name of a child who is gone, and treating them with the gravity they deserve. For those of us who have known real loss, who have sat in a house grown too quiet, who have reached for someone and found only the shape of where they used to be, this lands differently than it does for others. The healing is not in moving on. It is in finding what you still want to carry forward. Maybe that means pulling out the recipe cards in her handwriting on a Sunday afternoon, making the dish she always made for company. Not because the occasion requires it, but because the smell of it still fills the kitchen with something true. And the kitchen deserves that. Maybe it means calling the grandchild you haven't spoken to in a few weeks. Not because you have news, but because some connections need tending the way gardens do, regularly, without waiting for a special occasion to justify it. Maybe it simply means sitting at the window tomorrow morning with your coffee, before the television comes on and the list of things to do takes over, and letting yourself be still for 10 minutes, just you, and the light coming in, and the quiet knowledge that you have survived everything that has tried to diminish you so far. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole point. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment telling us the moment that hit closest to home. We read every one. The light came through the open door. It always had. They had simply, finally, stopped closing it. Love is the one light even the darkest hearts do not fear. Once they've chosen to let it in, this is not an automatic product of artificial intelligence. Every core idea and surprising twist was nurtured and written by a real human hand. AI only offered minor edits, like a sincere friend giving feedback.